quite certain that there will be a lot of non-Catholics in heaven because of what Vatican II, Lumen Gentium says. Vatican II says. Quite certain that there will be a lot of Vatican II in heaven, non-Catholics in heaven, non-Catholics in heaven, non-Catholics in heaven, non-Catholics in heaven.
I was recently called out by Catholic apologist Eric McCabe for accusing him of teaching blatant heresy without providing proof. Anyone who has read a treatise covering the basics of moral theology, specifically on the role of conscience, would realize that Eric has an erroneous view of invincible ignorance. I have already released a video on the doctrine of invincible ignorance, and have done 2 streams refuting Protestant apologists Redeem Zoomer and Anglican Aesthetics on this topic, which will be linked below. This shouldn't be a surprise to anyone, but anyone who dies a non-Catholic is going to hell. Perfect union with the soul of the Roman Catholic Church, and at least an implicit desire to be a member, are a necessity of means for salvation. In this video, I will be addressing one of the most absurd theological claims I have ever heard, the claim that an atheist who is invincibly ignorant can have implicit faith, and by cooperating with sufficient grace, can have that grace become efficacious for salvation. This is a complete bastardization of Catholic dogma.
The atheist, depending on what you mean by atheist, can also be saved. However, usually what qualifies an atheist being an atheist is a culpable and explicit rejection of God and supernatural faith. This would not suffice for salvation. However, there are self-proclaimed atheists who reject not God per se, but an idea of who or what God is. An atheist, even though he claims there is no God verbally, because he doesn't really know what that means, can still maintain an implicit faith, namely not willfully rejecting the truths of God and his revelation. That atheist may be saved through sufficient graces becoming efficacious, as graces were cooperated with in spite of the atheism, and implicit faith to go along with it.
There are many heretical statements set forward in this clip that I will have to dissect them one by one. First, I will demonstrate that it is a logical absurdity to suggest an atheist can have implicit faith. To posit the possibility of an atheist who is inculpable for remaining in that state is to undermine the certainty of God's existence from natural reason, which is under anathema at Vatican I and contradicts Holy Writ. Next, I will show that Eric McCabe's position falls into one of 2 heresies. Either he denies the necessity of the act of faith to receive sanctifying grace, which is condemned by the Council of Trent, or he denies the necessity of sanctifying grace for salvation, which is Pelagianism, and also condemned by the Council of Trent. To suggest an atheist who remains in that state can cooperate with sufficient grace and have it become efficacious is to demonstrate one does not even know what grace is and its diverse categories. First, I will refute the claim that an atheist can have implicit faith. To posit such an absurdly heretical claim is to demonstrate one does not even know what faith is. Faith is an assent that resides in the intellect based on testimony. It is distinct from scientific knowledge that discursively moves from effect to cause based on the natural light of reason. Faith is not believed based on the natural light of reason, rather it is believed based on the testimony of the agent who delivers it. For example, if my mother tells me that my father left when I was an infant, I believe her not because I can verify this evidence, rather I believe her based on the trustworthiness of her testimony. However, what I just described is merely human faith, not divine faith. As De Filius states, quote, "With the grace of God inspiring and assisting us, we believe to be true what he has revealed, not because we perceive its intrinsic truth by the natural light of reason, but because of the authority of God himself, who makes the revelation, and can neither deceive nor be deceived," end quote. Divine faith's formal object is the authority of God who reveals, who can neither deceive nor be deceived. To posit that an atheist who by rejecting the existence of God or is unsure of God's existence has the possibility of having implicit faith is a literal contradiction of terms. An atheist who rejects God's existence rejects the agent who has presented his testimony, and thus it is impossible for an atheist to have faith. How can someone who does not affirm faith's object have implicit faith? An atheist who has implicit faith is as logically absurd as affirming a squared circle or that 2 + 2 = 5. Now I will distinguish between explicit and implicit faith to demonstrate how even more absurd Eric's position is. The Wallenbergs define explicit and implicit faith as such, quote, "To believe explicitly is to believe something in itself so that it is the direct and immediate object upon which the assent of faith falls. To believe implicitly is to believe something only within another thing, because what is thus believed is not directly known, nor does the intellect form its own proper and distinct concept of the proposition that is said to be believed implicitly, but rather of another proposition in which the first is contained, end quote. Once one knows the distinction between explicit and implicit faith, the sophistry required to assert that an atheist can have implicit faith is self-evident. Implicit faith is contained only within explicit faith, so an atheist who rejects faith's formal object cannot have implicit faith because they do not have explicit faith. For example, a man by having explicit faith in the incarnation has implicit faith that Christ has a human will. Christ having a human will is the conclusion that follows from the premise that God became man, which is believed with explicit faith. However, without the premise that is believed with explicit faith, the conclusion that is believed with implicit faith does not follow. Saying that a particular atheist only rejects a caricature of God's existence is an obvious obfuscation, because without explicit faith in God's existence, it is impossible to have implicit faith. To give another example, implicit faith can only be contained within explicit faith. Just like an accident can only exist insofar as it adheres in a substance. Transubstantiation is the only exception to this. Just like the whiteness of a man is only real insofar as the man exists, so too implicit faith is only possible insofar as it is contained within explicit faith. The next question is thus: what is the necessity for supernatural faith in God's existence for salvation? Now we must distinguish between a necessity of precept and a necessity of means. The Salmaticenses give a great synthesis of these kinds of necessity. Quote, theologians commonly distinguish a twofold necessity, one of precept, the other of means. The former consists in an obligation arising from the precept of a superior, for just as absence of sin is required for salvation, so also supposing knowledge and power, the fulfillment of the precept is required, without which guilt is not avoided. The latter, however, is necessarily conducive to salvation, whether this connection be from the nature of the thing, as grace is related to glory, or from the institution of God, as baptism is related to the first grace. And although both necessities are accustomed to concur with regard to the same thing, as happens in baptism, whence the aforesaid distinction seems to be impugned, nevertheless several considerations quite clearly persuade that these necessities ought to be distinguished, and the said distinction admitted, end quote. To get right into the state of the question, supernatural faith in God's existence is not merely a necessity of precept, but also a necessity of means. The Salmaticenses distinguish between a necessity of means based on the nature of the thing, per se or absolute, or based on the ordination of God, or accidents or hypothetical. Supernatural faith that God is and that he rewards the just is a necessity of means per se, and therefore cannot be dispensed or substituted, for the intellectual assent to God's testimony is intrinsically tied to the nature of restoring friendship with God. As St. Paul states in his letter to the Hebrews, quote, but without faith it is impossible to please God, for he that cometh to God must believe that he is, and is a rewarder to them that seek him, end quote. De Filius also affirms the necessity of means per se that is intrinsically attached to belief that God exists. Quote, since he is one singular, completely simple, and unchangeable spiritual substance, he must be declared to be in reality and in essence distinct from the world, supremely happy in himself and from himself, and inexpressibly loftier than anything besides himself, which either exists or can be imagined, end quote. St. Paul states again in his letter to the Hebrews, quote, now faith is the substance of things to be hoped for, the evidence of things that appear not, end quote. The substance of things to be hoped for is the beatific vision, which is the final cause of man's existence, to peacefully contemplate the divine essence for all eternity. Faith is the beginning of justification. Justification infuses sanctifying grace into the soul, and grace is the seed of glory. For the elect, their faith will be replaced with vision after death. Quote, we see now through a glass in a dark manner, but then face to face. Now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am known, end quote. All of the steps I laid out are the means to attain the end, which is the light of glory. To violate a necessity of means, even inculpably, impedes the end, which is salvation. I have already demonstrated that it is impossible for an atheist to have faith. Hence, even if it were possible for an atheist to be inculpable for their state of atheism, they still could not be saved, for faith is a necessity of means per se, hence it cannot be dispensed, and is the means to how one attains the end, that is salvation. Furthermore, the possibility of an atheist being inculpable for their atheism should be vehemently rejected. To affirm that an atheist could possibly not be guilty of mortal sin for rejecting God's existence or even being unsure of his existence would logically lead to a denial that God's existence can be known with absolute certainty. To affirm the supposition while denying the consequence is a logical absurdity. This heretical supposition contradicts Holy Writ, quote, "Because that which is known of God is manifest in them, for God hath manifested it unto them. For the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, his eternal power also and divinity, so that they are inexcusable," end quote. The possibility of a good faith atheist is also a condemned proposition under Pope Alexander VIII. Quote, "Condemned. Philosophical or moral sin is a human act that is incongruent with rational nature and right reason. Theological and mortal sin, however, is the free transgression of divine law. Philosophical sin, however grave in one who either ignores God or does not think about God at the moment, is a grave sin, but not an offense against God, nor a mortal sin dissolving friendship with God, nor worthy of eternal punishment," end quote. Now that I have demonstrated that it is impossible for an atheist to have faith, and that an individual who remains in a state of atheism will be damned for mortal sin, the next step will be to demonstrate the conclusion that Eric McCabe's assertions lead to one of two heretical beliefs. If Eric denies the necessity of faith to receive sanctifying grace, he falls under the condemnation laid out by the Council of Trent, quote, "And whereas the apostle saith that man is justified by faith and freely, those words are to be understood in that sense which the perpetual consent of the Catholic Church hath held and expressed, to wit that we are therefore said to be justified by faith, because faith is the beginning of human salvation, the foundation and the root of all justification, without which it is impossible to please God and to come unto the fellowship of his sons. But we are therefore said to be justified freely, because that none of these things which precede justification, whether faith or works, merit the grace itself of justification. For if it be a grace, it is not now by works. Otherwise, as the same apostle says, grace is no more grace," end quote. Ludwig Ott cites Session 6 of the Council of Trent to support his thesis that the justification of an adult is not possible without faith, and assigns the theological note of de fide to it. Quote, "The justification of an adult is not possible without faith, de fide. According to the teaching of the Council of Trent, faith is the beginning of human salvation, the basis and the root of all justice," end quote. It should also be noted that Eric seems to be ignorant of the different categories of grace, for he asserts that for an atheist who cooperates with sufficient grace, that grace becomes efficacious. However, sufficient and efficacious grace are species of grace that fall under the genus of actual grace. Actual grace is what moves man to repentance and prepares him for justification. Actual grace without the assent of faith does not conduce to salvation. Ludwig Ott writes, quote, "Actual grace is distinguished into sufficient grace and efficacious grace. The former gives a person the power to accomplish the salutary act. The latter de facto secures that the salutary act is accomplished," end quote. The assent of faith and repentance are the dispositions necessary for baptism, which is the instrumental cause that infuses sanctifying grace in the soul. Sanctifying grace is also a necessity of means per se for salvation. No soul receives the beatific vision without it. Sanctifying grace is a habitual grace that is an accidental quality residing in the soul, hence why for the justification of the pious, man can grow in justice. Ludwig Ott writes again, quote, "Habitual grace is a constant supernatural quality of the soul, which sanctifies man intrinsically and makes him just and pleasing to God. Sanctifying grace or justifying grace," end quote. If Eric concludes that sanctifying grace is not necessary for salvation, he falls under the heresy of Pelagianism, which is also under anathema at the Council of Trent. Quote, "Canon 2, if anyone saith that the grace of God through Jesus Christ is given only for this, that man may be able more easily to live justly and to merit eternal life, as if by free will without grace he were able to do both, though hardly indeed and with difficulty, let him be anathema," end quote. When Lumen Gentium speaks about God including other religions in the plan of salvation, this is a simple affirmation that God antecedently provides all men with sufficient grace, and the truths of these false religions are remote preparations for the gospel. Quote, "For this is good and acceptable in the sight of God our Savior, who will have all men to be saved and to come to the knowledge of the truth," end quote. Lumen Gentium is speaking about the objective redemption, not the subjective redemption. When Lumen Gentium states, quote, "Those also can attain to salvation who through no fault of their own do not know the gospel of Christ or his church, yet sincerely seek God and moved by grace strive by their deeds to do his will as it is known to them through the dictates of conscience," end quote. It must be understood that this is not to the exclusion of the necessity for the act of faith. To ascertain this reading from Lumen Gentium would make it contradict the Council of Trent. This is why Lumen Gentium also states, quote, "Nor does divine providence deny the helps necessary for salvation to those who, without blame on their part, have not yet arrived at an explicit knowledge of God and with his grace strive to live a good life. Whatever good or truth is found amongst them is looked upon by the church as a preparation for the gospel," end quote. We must affirm the teaching of St. Thomas and the consensus of theologians that a non-Christian who is invincibly ignorant and is living according to the dictates of conscience via natural law would either be sent a preacher or receive an internal illumination so they can make a proper assent to faith. Quote, "For it pertains to divine providence to furnish everyone with what is necessary for salvation, provided that on his part there is no hindrance. Thus, if someone so brought up followed the direction of natural reason in seeking good and avoiding evil, we must most certainly hold that God would either reveal to him through internal inspiration what had to be believed, or would send some preacher of the faith to him, as Peter sent Cornelius," end quote. This tradition has been constantly upheld by Catholic theologians. For example, the Dominican theologian Francisco de Vitoria comments on the possibility for the salvation of the Native Americans, quote, "The barbarians who have never received any news of the faith or Christian religion will be damned for their mortal sins or their idolatry, but not for the sin of unbelief, as St. Thomas says. If they were to do their best to live well according to the law of nature, it is a fact that the Lord would take care to enlighten them concerning the name of Christ. But it does not follow from this that if they live evil lives, their ignorance or lack of belief in baptism in the Christian religion should be counted against them as a sin," end quote. It should also be noted that the truths of false religions are only on the order of nature, not grace, for natural knowledge of God does not suffice for salvation. One must make a supernatural act of faith that God is and that he rewards the just. Cardinal Ratzinger comments on the truths of false religions, quote, "Indeed, some prayers and rituals of the other religions may assume a role of preparation for the gospel, and that they are occasions of pedagogical helps in which the human heart is prompted to be open to the action of God. One cannot attribute to these, however, a divine origin or an ex opere operato salvific efficacy, which is proper to the Christian sacraments. Furthermore, it cannot be overlooked that other rituals, insofar as they depend on superstitions or other errors, constitute an obstacle to salvation," end quote. Atheism is not listed in Lumen Gentium among the belief systems that are included in God's plan of salvation, for the sin of unbelief is the gravest sin of all. Thus St. Thomas teaches, quote, "Every sin consists formally in aversion from God as stated above. Hence the more a sin severs man from God, the graver it is. Now man is more than ever separated from God by unbelief, because he has not even true knowledge of God, and by false knowledge of God man does not approach him, but is severed from him. Nor is it possible for one who has a false opinion of God to know him in any way at all, because the object of his opinion is not God. Therefore it is clear that the sin of unbelief is greater than any sin that occurs in the perversion of morals," end quote. Gaudium et Spes also states, quote, "The root reason for human dignity lies in man's call to communion with God. From the very circumstance of his origin, man is already invited to converse with God. For man would not exist were he not created by God's love and constantly preserved by it, and he cannot live fully according to truth unless he freely acknowledges that love and devotes himself to his Creator. Still, many of our contemporaries have never recognized this intimate and vital link with God, or have explicitly rejected it. Thus, atheism must be accounted among the most serious problems of this age and is deserving of closer examination," end quote. I'm sure that I'll likely be accused of pitting the old magisterium against the magisterium in modernity. However, I am simply reading Vatican II in light of the councils that have come before it. To read Vatican II in a manner that contradicts previous councils is to inadvertently posit that Vatican II infallibly overturned previous ecumenical councils, which is to believe that truth can contradict truth, that God, who can neither deceive nor be deceived, did not establish the Roman Catholic Church. This is why Dr. Alan Phimister writes, quote, "When Pope Paul VI said of the last ecumenical council that it avoided issuing solemn dogmatic definitions, engaging the infallibility of the ecclesiastical magisterium, he did not mean that Vatican II issued no infallible teaching, simply that it issued no new infallible teaching specifically identified as divinely revealed. In practice, as Joseph Ratzinger observed in 1988, the Second Vatican Council has been treated as though it made itself into a sort of super dogma which takes away the importance of all the rest. The effect of this has been to create two vast reservoirs of apostates. Those who think the council definitively contradicted equally definitive teaching issued by prior councils and popes and lament the fact, and those who think the council definitively contradicted equally definitive teaching issued by prior councils and popes and rejoice. Neither group, for the reason St. Thomas explains, possess the theological virtue of faith, and therefore neither group possesses the theological virtues of hope or charity either, end quote. Eric's heretical suppositions logically lead to the conclusion Dr. Allen lays out as individuals who lack theological faith. I'm not saying Eric is personally culpable. I am just stating that his heretical supposition leads to the conclusion Dr. Allen laid out earlier, to reinterpret Catholic dogma in a new way contrary to the mind of the Council Fathers is also heretical. De Filius states, quote, "If anyone says that it is possible that at some time, given the advancement of knowledge, a sense may be assigned to the dogmas propounded by the Church, which is different from that which the Church has understood and understands, let him be anathema," end quote. As I'm sure that Eric will most likely call into question my loyalty to the magisterium, I will briefly address his claim that I lack fidelity to the Roman Catholic Church. I can easily make the words of Professio Fide my own. With firm faith, I also believe everything contained in the Word of God, whether written or handed down in tradition, which the Church, either by a solemn judgment or by the ordinary and universal magisterium, sets forth to be believed as divinely revealed. I also firmly accept and hold each and everything definitively proposed by the Church regarding teaching on faith and morals. Moreover, I adhere with religious submission of will and intellect to the teachings which either the Roman Pontiff or the College of Bishops enunciate when they exercise their authentic magisterium, even if they do not intend to proclaim these teachings by a definitive act.
Notice he provides no quote, no video clip, no nothing for evidence. Just a bunch of cowardly and empty rhetoric coming from someone who rejects teaching from the current ordinary universal magisterium. Make a video or at least play a clip if you want to correct these blatantly heretical statements.
Eric demonstrates his profound ignorance of magisterial categories because he thinks that Pope Francis's teaching on capital punishment is a part of the ordinary universal magisterium. As Lumen Gentium states, quote, "Although the individual bishops do not enjoy the prerogative of infallibility, they nevertheless proclaim Christ's doctrine infallibly whenever, even though dispersed through the world, but still maintaining the bond of communion among themselves and with the successor of Peter, and authentically teaching matters of faith and morals, they are in agreement on one position as definitively to be held. This is even more clearly verified when gathered together in an ecumenical council. They are teachers and judges of faith and morals for the universal church, whose definitions must be adhered to with a submission of faith," end quote. Pope Francis's teaching on capital punishment has not been promulgated in a manner to where it is to be definitively held, either by solemn judgment or in her ordinary universal magisterium. It must be promulgated by the bishops in communion with the Pope in a particular mode, namely as definitively to be held, in order for it to be qualified as a part of the ordinary universal magisterium, as outlined in Lumen Gentium. Pope Francis's teaching on capital punishment falls under the merely authentic magisterium, as outlined in Lumen Gentium. Quote, "This religious submission of mind and will must be shown in a special way to the authentic magisterium of the Roman Pontiff, even when he is not speaking ex cathedra, that is, it must be shown in such a way that his supreme magisterium is acknowledged with reverence. The judgments made by him are sincerely adhered to, according to his manifest mind and will. His mind and will in the matter may be known either from the character of the documents, from his frequent repetition of the same doctrine, or from his manner of speaking," end quote. The assent owed to Pope Francis's teaching on capital punishment, laid out in Fratelli Tutti and Dignitatis Infinitas, is obsequium religiosum. I am not going to argue whether or not Catholics should withhold assent on Pope Francis's merely authentic magisterium concerning capital punishment. Rather, I am arguing that it can be licit to withhold assent on said teaching for extraordinary reasons, namely that Pope Francis's teaching on capital punishment is overruled by higher weight teaching. As Cardinal Ratzinger states, quote, "The willingness to submit loyally to the teaching of the magisterium on matters per se not irreformable must be the rule. It can happen, however, that a theologian may, according to the case, raise questions regarding the timeliness, the form, or even the contents of magisterial interventions. Here the theologian will need, first of all, to assess accurately the authoritativeness of the interventions, which becomes clear from the nature of the documents, the insistence with which a teaching is repeated, and the very way in which it is expressed," end quote. The possibility of withholding assent to the non-infallible magisterium is something outlined by various Catholic theologians. For example, Ludwigot, quote, "The ordinary and usual form of the papal teaching activity is not infallible. Furthermore, the decisions of the Roman congregations, Holy Office, Bible Commission are not infallible. Nevertheless, normally they are to be accepted with an inner assent, which is based on the high supernatural authority of the Holy See. The so-called silentium obsequium, that is, reverent silence, does not generally suffice. By way of exception, the obligation of inner assent may cease if a competent expert, after a renewed scientific investigation of all grounds, arrives at the positive conviction that the decision rests on an error." End quote. Next, the moral theologians John McCabe and Charles Callan, quote, "Many tenets of the Church indeed have not the prerogative of infallibility, for example, decrees of the Pope not given ex cathedra, decisions of congregations made with papal approval, teachings of bishops to particular members of the Church, doctrines commonly held by Catholics as theological truths or certain conclusions. These decrees, decisions, etc. receive not the assent of Catholic faith, but what is called religious assent, which includes two things: external and internal assent. External assent should be given such teachings, that is, the homage of respectful silence due to public authority. This does not forbid the submission of difficulties to the teaching authority or the scientific examination of objections that seem very strong. Internal assent should be given such teaching, that is, the submission of judgment of the individual to the judgment of the teacher who has the authority from Christ and assistance from the Holy Spirit. This internal assent differs, however, from the assent of faith, inasmuch as it excludes fear of error, but not the possibility of error, and it may later on be suspended, called into doubt, or even revoked." End quote. Next, the theologian Dr. John Joy, quote, "The precise nature of this religious submission has been a subject of much discussion, but most authors conclude that it does leave room for some kind of legitimate dissent, or at least non-assent from this kind of authoritative but non-infallible teaching." End quote. Lastly, Father Bernard Luchin, quote, "Religious assent, this is an act of the intellect, a probable judgment, not formally an assent of faith. Probable should not be understood in a mathematical or statistical sense, but as a qualitative appreciation of the causes that properly elicit an act of the understanding. At a certain point, a proposition appears to be worthy of approval or probable, with exclusion of the contrary probability. This kind of probability varies, but it always entails the exclusion of the probability of the contrary proposition. This act, which is an assent of the understanding and not an act of faith, neither depends in itself upon the moral virtue of obedience, nor even upon that of religion, although this latter virtue is implied in the act. It seems that this act should be formally related to supernatural docility, and that it constitutes one of the acts of this intellectual virtue, i.e. the capacity to receive a teaching well, in keeping with the fact that according to the characteristics of human nature, he who learns should begin by believing that which his teacher teaches him. Error is improbable, but not impossible at the second degree. A well-informed Catholic could find evidence of an error in such a magisterial act. He would then be able to suspend his interior assent, but yet with prudence, because even a gifted scholar is not immune from error. Before concluding that it is the magisterium that is mistaken, it is necessary for him to verify his own arguments carefully and to submit them to truly competent persons. The question is more delicate as to whether the case can be given some publicity. Indeed, it is conceivable that the state of urgency arising from the diffusion of such an error would warrant a public statement of the contrary position, while preserving the respect due to the legitimate authority. This attitude is clearly distinct from the systematic campaigns of opposition to the magisterium known under the name of dissent. In the order of morality, as is well known, it has been necessary for the efforts and the pressure of an unjustly hostile outside world to intervene for the authority to acknowledge facts. Many of you found that when you were courageous enough to speak of what happened to you, no one would listen. As questions of the faith are hardly the concern of the media, such external pressure does not exist in this domain. Nevertheless, for more than 50 years, numerous offenses against the faith of the faithful and of children in particular committed by churchmen have been drawn to the attention of competent authorities, and those who exposed such offenses found that no one would listen. It would thus be opportune for the authority to proclaim clearly that, faced with circumstances in which no one would listen when the complaint was made discreetly, it can become legitimate to speak publicly to all of the church. Furthermore, since this degree of authority encompasses a vast continuum of teachings of greater or lesser force, the improbability of error becomes greater as the simply or merely authentic magisterium engages itself more, even while remaining below infallibility. Within this degree, we frequently encounter cases that are difficult to characterize with exactitude." End quote. It is clear from the numerous citations from Catholic theologians I have provided is that Eric himself is ignorant of Catholic magisteriology. unless Eric would dare to suggest that he has a better understanding of the magisterium than Ludwig Ott, John McHugh, Charles Callan, Dr. John Joy, and Father Bernard Luchin. Eric also seems to be ignorant of what Cardinal Ratzinger intended to condemn in Donum Veritatis concerning public dissent. A simple statement online withholding assent for an extraordinary reason to the merely authentic magisterium does not constitute public dissent. Rather, it is when the media is employed to pressure the church into changing doctrine. Quote, in this context, it is also necessary to consider how tensions can be constructively arbitrated. The fact that the instruction rejects the appeal to the media as a channel of dialogue between the magisterium and theology has encountered resolute opposition. It is comprehensible that the media themselves have reacted with exasperation to this passage, but it is obvious that theologians are equally reluctant to relinquish this weapon. Regarding the matter itself, it must be conceded that numbers 29 to 31 of the instruction can be misunderstood if they are isolated from their context, especially paragraphs 25 and 26. Taken out of context, in fact, they can give rise to the impression that the instruction allows the theologian the sole option of submitting divergent opinions to the magisterial authorities in secret and obliges him to suffer in silence if he is unsuccessful. Nevertheless, in light of the whole text, which speaks of fruitful tensions and their value, it is quite obvious that the instruction is not proposing secret communications, but dialogue which remains on an ecclesiastical and scientific plane and avoids distortions at the hands of the mass media. If this is secret, then all science must be called secret. In actuality, the point is precisely to use arguments instead of pressure as a means of persuasion. And when theologians reproach the magisterium with mistrust, where do they detect it? It is difficult to dismiss the suspicion that for their part, they do not believe it possible to impress the magisterium with reasoned arguments, so that the only choice left is to have recourse to power instead. Today, it is very easy to mobilize the influence of the media against the magisterium of the church. I find it inconceivable that anyone can entertain the notion that truth and unity in the church are to be served by these expedients. We may in fact legitimately assume that in such cases of loyal dissent, there are issues at stake which presuppose knowledge of the science of theology and the believer's sympathy with the church. Neither of these is the concern of the mass media, which in these circumstances cannot contribute any added depth to the dispute, though they can indeed exasperate conflicts. In modern society, which is dominated by the media, the law of the church and the power of Rome, which are allegedly so perilous, appear on the contrary like the young David facing the giant Goliath. When the bearers of the apostolic office dare today to exercise the authority which has been committed to them in matters of doctrine, they enter almost inevitably into the form of apostolic existence depicted by St. Paul. We have become and are now, as the refuse of the world, the offscoring of all things. The authority of the church can continue to be exercised in our society only in the sign of contradiction, and precisely in this way it returns to its true nature." End quote. My point with all of these citations is to prove that Eric is in no position to be questioning an individual Catholic's fidelity to Christ's church, when he himself is ignorant of magisterial categories, has promoted heresy, and has been publicly corrected by a Protestant for contradicting magisterial teaching.
I'm not the one who is rejecting the teaching of the current living magisterium on the death penalty. For those of you who are genuinely struggling and questioning the teaching on the death penalty, that is perfectly licit. But to publicly criticize the magisterium and the 4,400 Catholic bishops who disagree with you is not licit. It's sinful and scandalous. So don't worry about my arguments. Worry about your conscience and fidelity to Christ's church. What's revealing is that those who think they know better than the Pope and College of Bishops on the matter, they have to come up with the most facile, backbending arguments to try to validate their claims, when all you need is the humility and docility of a child to simply submit to the church's magisterium.
I'm not bound to the catechism of the Council of Trent.
I would deny that, because the Catechism of the Council of Trent was approved by the Pope. It is magisterial per the Professio Fide. You are bound to affirm all that the Pope has approved as part of his magisterium, whether infallible or not, to give religious submission of mind and will to it. And so you are bound then, per the structure of your own church's authority system, to affirm the Roman Catechism as an authoritative exposition of the Council of Trent, because that conforms to the intention of the pontiff. It is magisterial per the Professio Fide. It is magisterial per the Professio Fide. It is magisterial per the Professio Fide. It is magisterial.